Okay, so today we're going to move on to the myths of origins. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Jewish vision of the creation of the world and the creation of humanity, as well as the creation of the tradition. We've talked a bit about it already. We'll just go into a little bit more detail in terms of the beginning of Judaism as a religion. So, the first thing that we're going to talk about today is the creation of the world according to Judaism, which is according to the Torah or the Hebrew Bible, the sacred text of Judaism. And you guys read the creation stories for your reading for this week. So the word that I have here, Genesis, this refers to the first chapter or what's called book within the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is divided up into several chapters, which are actually referred to as books because originally they were separate books. The Hebrew Bible was not necessarily one book altogether. It was in scroll form, and the different texts were separate and then were compiled together into a single sacred text of Judaism. So in the book of Genesis, there are two creation stories, and you read both of those creation stories for your reading this week. If you haven't, make sure to do that as soon as possible. And there's a couple of important differences between the two creation stories. The first creation story is the one that opens the Hebrew Bible. It starts the very first verse, which is the first section of Genesis, and it talks about the creation of the world. In it, God is described as a spirit. God is hovering over the water. And then God begins the act of creation of the world through speech. So God is, again, all powerful, and God creates the world through his speech, through words. And this first story goes through the order of creation. And creation happens in a very orderly, sequential way over 6 different days. And on each day, God creates one aspect of our world, one aspect of creation. God creates, the sun and the moon, the water, the land, vegetation, animals. And then finally, on the 6th day, the culmination of that creative process is the creation of man and woman, the creation of humankind. So in the first creation story, the world is really made ready for men and women, for this first man and woman. Everything is created, everything is prepared for them. And then at the end, as it says in the text, God created both male and female, man and woman, in his image, so in God's image, that there's a special connection between humans and God. So that's the first creation story. And then following that is what's known as the second creation story in Judaism. This is the story that talks about the Garden of Eden. It talks about Adam and Eve, and it talks about the forbidding of the eating of the fruit. So in this story, God tells Adam and Eve they can eat, any of the fruit in the garden. Actually, I should say, before that, it's a different order of creation. This is the story that does talk about, the tree and not eating the fruit and the eating of the fruit. But before that happens, there are some key differences between the first creation story and the second creation story. In the second creation story, God creates the garden, then God creates man. So God creates just Adam. Then God creates a couple of other things, vegetation, animals, and then after all that, God creates woman. So it's a very different conception of the creation of human beings. The first version, we have everything in the world being prepared, and then finally, male and female, man and woman are created at the same time. In the second version, man is created, the world is created, then man, so just Adam, then the rest of creation is made, the animals and the vegetation, and then finally woman is created as a helper for Adam. And that God said it's not good for man to be alone, so that's the version where God causes Adam to go to sleep. He takes a rib, takes something from the side of Adam, and creates Eve from it. So it's it has these significant differences in it between these two creation stories, and that's one of the major reasons why Jewish scholars divide it up into two creation stories, two different stories about the creation of mankind and the world. So those are important to note, and it's important to understand that in Judaism, it's understood that these are two different stories. They likely came from two different authors and two different time periods, right? Because the Hebrew Bible was composed over hundreds and hundreds of years by various different authors, and then these sections were finally put together. So it's not surprising that there are two different creation stories that probably arose at two different times over the course of Jewish history. There are lots of different theories within Jewish theology about the differences in creation, and actually a lot of them point to the first two men and women, or the first man and woman that were created, are different from the second two. They're not actually the same creations, because the first pair were created at the same time, and then the second one, we have Adam, and then later on Eve being created. So there are some Jewish theologians who say that the first pair of human beings that were created were actually hermaphroditic creatures, because the text says male and female he created them. So you could read the line a certain way that it actually looks like maybe the first creations of God were made both male and female. So they were two human beings who each had aspects of male and female anatomy. Those were the first two creations, and then in the second story we get to the creation of Adam and Eve. So those are the first two human beings. There's also another theory which has kind of gone in and out of favor. It sort of belongs more to Jewish folklore, which says that the man is the same in both stories, but the woman is different. So this story says that the first woman that was created is not Eve. The first woman that was created was a woman named Lilith. And some of you may have heard of the legend of Lilith or the story of Lilith before. But this story says that originally God created Adam and Lilith. But Lilith was not obedient. She was not subservient to Adam. She did not want to obey him as a good wife in the traditional sense should. So she actually rebelled against God and Adam, and she ran away and went off into, out of the Garden of Eden to live. Then there's lots of stories in medieval times. Lilith was seen as like a demon witch figure who was, she was evil and she would, do bad things. And then later on, actually, she becomes a favorite of the feminist movement. Many feminists look to the legend of Lilith, see her as, a strong feminist, as a rebel, a woman who didn't want to be subservient to her husband. So there's different stories about that, but just important to note that in Judaism, they are two different stories. So the scholarly work, the theological work, is done around, well, what's going on in these two different stories? Why were both stories included? If both stories are in here, they have something to teach us. So the second story is the one that talks about the tree and God prohibiting Adam and Eve from eating of the tree, from eating the fruit of that tree. So in that version of the story, as you'll read in your text, right, God tells Adam and Eve that they can have any fruit that they want. They can eat from the trees of eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Well, they end up eating the fruit. A snake tempts Eve to eat the fruit. She then gives it to Adam. Adam eats the fruit as well, and God, of course, finds out, and God is very upset. In the text, there are 3 different punishments that come from this eating of the fruit. So because Adam and Eve disobeyed God and then lied about it, right, God asks them, what's going on, and they try to cover up the fact, which in Judaism, that's what not the sin, that's what went wrong. It's not that they ate the fruit. All human beings are going to make mistakes. It's that they were not honest about it before God. They tried to lie to God. But of course, God finds out, and there are 3 punishments that come from it. The first is death. So God says, okay, now you have to die. The second one is pain in childbirth. So Eve and all women have to go through pain when they give birth to children. And the third one is toil or work. So we do not live in the Garden of Eden. We do not live where food and our resources are just abundantly provided for us. We have to work for our food. We have to struggle and toil in order to survive in this world. So there are certain punishments that humankind gets because of this mistake that Adam and Eve made. It's important to note here, however, many of you may be familiar with this story from a Christian perspective. This is a very important story because it's actually the exact same creation myth that Christianity uses. Christianity ends up adopting virtually all of the Hebrew Bible as their own sacred text, or the first section of their own sacred text. When we get to Christianity, we'll talk about why the early Christian movement decided to do that. But for now, it's important to know that this story is the same exact story that we see in Christianity. And we'll eventually see it's the same story, virtually the same story, with a little bit of differences in Islam. So the Quran also has a story of Adam and Eve in the garden. It's not quite the same, but there are many similarities between them. So if you're familiar with this story from a Christian perspective, this story is very important because of a Christian doctrine called original sin. There's an idea in Christianity that because of what Adam and Eve did, all human beings are born with sin upon them. So they are born imperfect. We are not born innocent according to Christian doctrine because we have inherited this original sin of Adam and Eve. We will talk much more about that when we talk about Christianity, but just to note, if you're familiar with that doctrine, you need to know that that's not part of the Jewish tradition. So Judaism does not have a conception of original sin. Even though it's the exact same creation story, Judaism and Christianity interpret this story very differently. In the Jewish tradition, there is no concept of human beings being born imperfect in some way because of what Adam and Eve did. There are punishments that come from the eating of the fruit, right? We die, we came from dust, to dust we shall return, the pain in childbirth, and we have to work hard for our living. But that's it. Those are the only punishments that humanity gets. So just important to know that there is no original sin. That's not how the story is viewed in the Jewish tradition. Adam and Eve are seen as more just sort of normal human beings who, of course, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to do what they're not supposed to do. But their big mistake was lying before God. Their big mistake was trying to hide something from God. So they did not understand the true Jewish conception of God. God is all powerful and all knowing. So it is not, it's pointless to try to hide something from God. So the story itself teaches more the true nature of God in Judaism. Right? It teaches us about our nature, that we are imperfect, that we do fall short sometimes of what we want to do, what we hope to do. But God is perfect, God is all powerful, and God is all knowing. So we have to be honest to God. We have to be honest before God. But other than that, there are lots of different interpretations within Judaism of this story. So there's really no sort of set understanding of this story. And as we'll talk much more about over the course of this unit, debate in Judaism is very, very important, and it's a good thing. Sorry to say this right. Within Judaism, the idea of interpreting any biblical text is that the understanding has to continue. There is no sort of set, fixed meaning or interpretation for any text within the Hebrew Bible. The sacred process is continuing to delve deeper and deeper into the meaning, to have dialogue, discussion, and debate about that meaning. But there is not an idea in Judaism of oh, well, this is what this text means. And this is something we all agree on, that this text means exactly this. No. In Judaism, the truth of any text is that throughout time, you continue to discuss, debate, and dialogue about the meaning of that text. And the meaning is never fixed because it's from God, and therefore it's divine and eternal. So meanings are going to continue to evolve throughout time. As our civilization changes, as humanity changes, we can see more and more of the truth of an individual text. So we'll talk a lot more about that too when we get to doctrine within Judaism, but that's an important part of the Jewish tradition to know. So those are the two, excuse me, the two creation stories that are present in the book of Genesis that you're reading for this week. So make sure you pay close attention to those stories. The last part of this slide, we already talked about this, but just to note that the Jewish religion starts with the covenant. The covenant is that contractual relationship between Abraham and God. That's where the covenant starts, but the covenant does change and expand over time. So the covenant is renewed. The covenant is renewed with Noah, and the covenant is renewed with several of Abraham's descendants, and it's also renewed with Moses. So the Mosaic covenant is the one under which Jews are currently living. We will talk about Moses and the law that he is given by God, but much later on in Jewish history, after the Exodus story, which we'll talk about on the next slide, that original covenant between Abraham and God is renewed through a man named Moses. Moses is a very important individual for the Jewish tradition, and he is the one that God reveals his law to. So God expands upon his original requirement of Abraham. So remember that God asks Abraham to follow him and obey him. Right? Whatever I tell you to do, that's what you need to do. That rule is still in effect, but God gives Moses much more detailed instructions. He reveals an entire law code to him and says, this is what I mean when I say to obey me and follow me. I'm going to give you explicit and concrete instructions on how to do that. So the Mosaic law, the Jewish law code, is the detailed instructions for how to live a Jewish life according to the covenant. So this contract is still in effect, although as we'll see within the Jewish tradition, interpretation and adherence to the Jewish law code varies quite widely across the spectrum of Jewish communities today. But the covenant is still in effect, and because God originally chose Abraham to have this special relationship with, Jews are still known as God's chosen people. This is a term you may have heard already, but this is an important understanding of the Jewish people and their relationship to God. It's important to know, though, that for Jewish people, being God's chosen people does not mean that they have it easier in this world. For the Jewish people, it actually means that their journey in this world is much more difficult. It's much more difficult, one, because they have to follow this Jewish law code. As I said, we'll talk more about it in depth, but there are 613 laws in this law code, right? It's not just the 10 Commandments, if you're familiar with that. The entire Jewish law code contains 613 mitzvot, or laws within it. So living a Torah-observant Jewish life is very difficult because there's over 600 laws that you have to follow. And those laws cover, every aspect of daily life: what you eat, what you wear, how you deal with your neighbors, how you deal with people that owe you money, how you deal with your enemies, how you treat your animals. It really goes into depth in every aspect of daily life. So being God's chosen people means that God has chosen you to live a much more strict lifestyle. So again, it doesn't mean that life is easier for you. Also, as we'll see, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, for the Jewish people, it means that they are they are a target of persecution and have been since this covenantal relationship began. Right? God called the Jewish people to be a sort of a beacon of justice and of ethical monotheism, to bring that message to the world. So because of that, because of their differences in belief, their differences in lifestyle, the Jewish people have been a frequent target of persecution. As we'll see, the Holocaust was really just the most recent and most egregious example of this persecution. But this is something that has been happening over and over in Jewish history. The idea of this persecution, or this pattern of this persecution, starts with the Exodus, and that story becomes very important for the Jewish people as they continue to experience persecution and hope for eventual freedom from it. So these are the two aspects of what it means to be God's chosen people. You live a different lifestyle. You are, subject to this intense law code that non-Jews are not, and you are subject to this persecution. So it also means that you have to remain strong and brave in the face of this continued persecution throughout history. So being God's chosen people, it may sound like a great title, a great name, but the idea is that no, it is not easier to be God's chosen people. It actually means that in this world you have a much more difficult journey. And we'll talk much more about that as well when we get to ethics and doctrine. Okay, so that's all we have for myths of origin, and next we're going to move on to historical myths.